At 2:14 a.m. on October 24, 1942, Private First Class Angelo Rizzo crouched in a flooded foxhole on the west bank of the Matanica River, Guadalcanal, holding a 9-foot length of scavenged pipe with a barbed steel hook welded to the end, and waited for 1,100 Japanese soldiers to come through the kunai grass. The odds were not close. Rizzo's platoon numbered 34 men. Colonel Kiyotake Kawaguchi's assault force, reinforced that week, pushed more than 1,000 soldiers into a single mile of front. Command had told them to expect probing fire. What came instead was a human wave, bayonets fixed, screaming through the dark toward a thin line of exhausted Marines who had not slept in 3 days. By dawn, 7 men would be dead in front of Rizzo's position alone, killed not by bullets, but by a weapon no ordnance manual recognized, one he had built himself out of boat parts and stubbornness, in defiance of a direct order, under threat of court-martial. This is the story of how a Gloucester fisherman's gaff hook became the only thing standing between a broken line and a slaughter, and why the United States Marine Corps never officially admitted it happened. The weapon that made it possible violated at least 3 standing regulations. Its inventor built it in defiance of a direct order from his own lieutenant. And when battalion command finally learned what had happened in that foxhole, the question on the table was not whether Angelo Rizzo had saved lives. It was whether saving them the way he'd done it was a court-martial offense regardless. Angelo Rizzo grew up on Rocky Neck, a finger of granite jutting into Gloucester Harbor, Massachusetts, where his father and 3 uncles worked the swordfish boats out of the Grand Banks. By age 12, Rizzo was gaffing fish twice his own weight, driving a barbed steel hook through a thrashing swordfish's flank, and hauling 300 pounds of muscle over the gunwale before it could tear the hook free or take a man's arm off in the process. It was not romantic work. It was cold, fast, and unforgiving. A gaff man who hesitated lost fish, lost fingers, sometimes lost his life to a swordfish's bill. Rizzo learned the geometry of it early, where to strike, how to set the hook so it would not pull loose, how a single clean motion could end a fight that brute strength alone never would. He was quiet by nature, the kind of quiet that other men sometimes mistook for slowness until they watched him work. On the boats, his uncles valued him precisely because he didn't talk himself out of a hard call once he'd made it. A gaff man who second-guessed his own hands lost the fish and sometimes lost the fight. Rizzo never had that problem. It was a personality trait that would matter far more, and far sooner than anyone in his family could have guessed. He enlisted in the Marine Corps in January 1942, 3 weeks after his 18th birthday, and shipped out with the 1st Marine Division that summer. Boot camp at Parris Island taught him to march, to strip a rifle in the dark, and to follow orders without asking why. Nothing in it prepared him for what waited on Guadalcanal. The island was a green hell of razor grass, malaria, and a jungle so dense that combat routinely closed to arm's length. American bayonet doctrine, developed for the open fields of Europe, assumed lunging thrusts with clear sightlines and room to withdraw the blade. Guadalcanal offered neither. Marines fought from waterlogged foxholes at night, in rain, against an enemy trained from childhood in bayonet combat, and willing to charge directly into machine gun fire. The M1905 bayonet issued to Marine riflemen carried a 16-inch blade forged from carbon steel, designed under a doctrine that assumed European trench distances, and a lunge-and-withdraw technique practiced against straw dummies on a parade ground. It weighed just under a pound, flexed under lateral pressure, and locked onto the muzzle of an M1 Garand with a spring-loaded catch that jungle mud fouled within days. None of that mattered in daylight skirmishes at 40 yards. All of it mattered at night in a foxhole, when the fighting closed to arm's length and stayed there. The failures piled up fast, and Rizzo watched them happen to men he knew. Corporal Thomas Delaney took a bayonet thrust to the throat on September 14th when his own blade snapped clean at the tang. The standard M1905 bayonet unable to withstand a parrying block against a Japanese Arisaka rifle's heavier steel. He bled out in the mud before the corpsman reached him. Private Frank Esposito froze on the night of September 21st when his bayonet lodged in an enemy soldier's ribcage and would not pull free. He was still wrenching at the stuck blade when a second attacker's rifle butt caved in the side of his skull. He died 2 days later at the aid station without regaining consciousness. Sergeant Walter Novick lost 3 fingers on October 2nd trying to parry an Arisaka thrust bare-bladed, the standard grip offering no real leverage once the fight closed to a foot of separation. He survived, but he never held a rifle the same way again. And on the night of October 9th, Private Michael Gallagher, 20 years old from Providence, a man who had shared his last cigarette with Rizzo 2 nights before, was bayoneted through the chest in a foxhole 11 yards from Rizzo's own position. Rizzo heard him call for a corpsman. Rizzo heard him stop. Battalion medical records for the first 3 weeks of the Matnikau engagements listed 41 bayonet casualties among Rizzo's regiment, 26 of them fatal. Divisional intelligence noted, almost in passing, that the standard-issue bayonet's thin blade and straight tang made it prone to breakage against the heavier Japanese equivalent, and that its lack of a barb or hook meant a solid hit still allowed a wounded enemy soldier to keep fighting, sometimes for minutes, before he went down. The nights blurred together after that. Rain fell almost without pause through the second half of September, turning every foxhole into a shin-deep trench of standing water. Men slept in 2-hour shifts if they slept at all, rifles across their knees, listening to the kunai grass move in ways the wind alone did not explain. Malaria and dysentery thinned the ranks nearly as fast as combat did. Rizzo lost 11 pounds in 3 weeks and stopped noticing. Divisional supply reports from late September logged bayonet losses at a rate roughly triple that of rifle losses in the same period. Blades snapped, bent past use, or simply lost in the mud during close engagements and never recovered. Ordnance officers attributed the figure to combat wastage and requested replacement stock through normal channels, a process that in practice meant weeks of delay while men in the line made do with what they had. Nobody above the rank of captain seemed inclined to do anything about it. Rizzo raised the issue with his platoon commander, Lieutenant Frank Beaumont, on October 11th, 3 weeks into the fighting. He explained it the only way he knew how, in the language of a man who had spent a decade putting steel into moving flesh. "The blade's too thin, sir. It flexes on impact and it's got nothing to hold the man once you're in him. He can still fight you with a foot of your own steel in his gut." Beaumont, a Mustang officer who had come up through the ranks and trusted his NCOs more than most, did not dismiss the observation outright. But he had no authority to change issued equipment, and no ordnance officer within 500 miles willing to entertain field modifications to standard pattern weapons. "Rizzo, I hear you. But it's what we've got. You improvise a fix and it goes wrong, that's a court-martial. Modifying issued weapons without authorization, that's the regulation, not me being difficult." The trigger came 4 nights later, not from another death, but from a resupply crate. On October 15th, a landing craft delivered replacement parts for the battalion's motor pool, angle iron, coils of tempered wire, an acetylene torch for field repairs, and a crate of scrap steel salvaged from a wrecked Japanese landing barge on the beach near Cucum. Rizzo, assigned to help unload it, ran his hand across a length of half-inch steel rod and felt, for the first time in weeks, something click into place. He did not sleep that night. He lay in his foxhole turning the geometry over in his head, the same calculations he had made 100 times on the deck of his uncle's boat. Hook angle, barb depth, shaft length, the balance point that let a man drive a point home and control it, instead of losing it to whatever was on the other end. He thought about Gallagher's voice calling for a corpsman and then not calling for anything. He thought about the specific mechanics of failure, a bayonet that flexed instead of held, a straight blade that let a wounded man keep moving, keep fighting, keep pulling a trigger for the better part of a minute before blood loss finally caught up with him. On a fishing boat, that kind of mistake cost you a fish. In a foxhole, it cost you a friend. He also thought, with the plain, unromantic clarity of a man raised on the docks, about what regulation actually protected. Lieutenant Beaumont wasn't wrong about the risk. Modifying issued equipment without authorization was a court-martial offense whether or not it worked, and a summary board in an active combat zone had wide latitude to make an example of a man who broke that rule, effective solution or not. Rizzo weighed it anyway, turning it over the way he'd once weighed the cost of a lost gaff hook against a lost swordfish, and came out the same place every time. 2 nights later, in the 2-hour gap between watch rotations, he went to the motor pool. The motor pool at 1:00 a.m. smelled of gasoline, rust, and the wet earth stench that never left Guadalcanal. Rizzo worked by a shielded flashlight, the acetylene torch turned low enough that its glow would not carry past the tree line. He started with a 9-foot section of half-inch steel rod, straightened it against a truck axle, and heated the last 14 inches until it glowed orange enough to bend. Using a fisherman's eye rather than an engineer's protractor, he curved the tip into a hook, not a straight spear point, but a barb angled back on itself at roughly 30 degrees, exactly the geometry that let a gaff hook set into a swordfish and hold rather than glance off. He filed the inside curve of the hook to a razor edge, the way his father had taught him, so the barb would cut on the way in and lock on any attempt to withdraw. He wrapped the shaft in a coil of the resupply wire for grip and weighted the base with a scavenged length of pipe fitting, so the balance point sat 18 inches from his lead hand. close enough to the swordfish gaffs he'd swung 10,000 times that his hands found the grip without thinking. The work took 3 hours. His palms blistered from the torch heat. Twice he heard boots on the coral path outside and froze, certain he'd been found, certain this would end with him in front of a battalion commander explaining why he'd been welding at 3:00 a.m. instead of standing his post. He knew exactly what he was risking. Unauthorized modification of a combat position, misuse of Marine Corps property, absence from an assigned area, any one of those was enough for a summary court-martial. Combined in the middle of an active campaign, a board might call it worse. He built the weapon anyway and told no one it existed. By the time the sky began to gray, Rizzo had a 9-foot fishing gaff reforged as a trench spear, and no plan beyond keeping it within reach. For 9 days nothing happened. Rizzo kept the gaff spear wedged against the foxhole wall, half covered with a poncho, and told his foxhole partner, Private Sal DeLuca, only that it was something from home. DeLuca, 18 and unbothered by things that weren't currently trying to kill him, didn't ask twice. Command had no idea it existed. Lieutenant Beaumont walked the line twice during that stretch and never noticed the extra length of steel leaning in the mud behind Rizzo's shoulder. During those 9 quiet days, Rizzo kept watch on the line the way he'd once kept watch on a long line for the first sign of a strike, patient, alert, saying little. He cleaned the gaff spear each morning with a rag dipped in engine oil, checked the wire wrapping for fraying, and ran his thumb along the inside curve of the barb to confirm the edge still held. DeLuca noticed the ritual and never once asked about it beyond the first night. Some things on Guadalcanal a man learned not to ask about. Twice during that stretch, other Marines came by the position for reasons that had nothing to do with military business, drawn by rumor of the length of pipe leaning in the mud. A corporal from the mortar section examined it, turned it over once, and pronounced it somebody's fishing pole before walking off laughing. Rizzo let the joke stand. It was easier than the alternative. On the night of October 23rd, Division Intelligence intercepted radio traffic suggesting a major push. Colonel Kawaguchi was preparing to throw his full regiment across the Matanikau in a single concentrated assault, aiming to break the American line before dawn and open the road to Henderson Field. Rizzo's company took the order to stand to at 9:00 p.m. Rain fell in sheets. Visibility dropped past 10 yards. Somewhere out in the black kunai grass, more than 1,000 Japanese soldiers were moving into position, and the Marines in the line had no way to know exactly where or when the first wave would come. At 1:50 a.m., a flare went up over the river mouth. For a quarter second, the grass in front of Rizzo's position turned into a field of running men. The first wave hit at 2:14 a.m. Rizzo's bar man opened up immediately, the muzzle flash strobing the dark. Bodies fell in the grass, but more kept coming, and behind the first wave came a second, closer, faster screaming. The air filled with sound all at once. Rifle fire. Grenade burst somewhere down the line. A voice screaming banzai that seemed to come from every direction and no direction. Rain hammered the poncho over Rizzo's shoulders, and under it the smell of cordite and wet earth, and faintly, gasoline from a jeep parked too close to the line an hour earlier. 40 yards. 30. Bullets weren't stopping all of them. At 15 yards, 3 Japanese soldiers broke from the grass directly toward Rizzo's foxhole. He dropped his rifle. No time to reload. No time for anything but the weapon he'd built for exactly this. He drove the gaff spear forward into the lead soldier's chest as the man crossed the parapet. The barb went in clean, caught, and held. Rizzo twisted his hips the way he'd twisted them on 100 swordfish decks, and hauled the man sideways off his feet in a single motion, clearing the point for the next thrust before the body hit the ground. Second man, same motion. The hook caught the webbing of the man's pack straps and drove through, the barb locking so the soldier's own momentum did the killing. A third came from the flank. Rizzo pivoted, planted, drove the spear up under the rim of the man's helmet at the throat. The barb held. He hauled back. The man went down. DeLuca screamed something Rizzo didn't process. More shapes in the grass. Rizzo reset his grip, feet apart, weight low, exactly the stance for a fish running hard against the gaff. Fourth, the hook caught a helmet strap and tore the helmet half off the man's skull before finding the flesh beneath. Down. Fifth, a glancing hit that still caught enough of the barb to spin the man off balance into DeLuca's bayonet. Sixth came almost on top of the fifth, no gap between them in the chaos, and Rizzo's thrust took him through the shoulder into the chest cavity, the barb setting hard enough that Rizzo felt it lock through the shaft into his palms. Seventh, and the last of that immediate rush, took the hook square under the chin as he vaulted the parapet, his own charging speed doing half of Rizzo's work for him. Elapsed time from the first thrust to the seventh man down, 11 seconds, by DeLuca's later account, though under fire no man's internal clock is reliable. What is certain, confirmed by 3 witnesses in adjoining foxholes, is that 7 Japanese soldiers went down at Rizzo's position in that single assault, and not one of them rose again to continue the fight, a claim no bayonet casualty that month had matched, since a bayoneted man frequently kept fighting for a full minute or more before blood loss ended it. The wave broke. Whatever remained of it withdrew into the grass, leaving the dead where they'd fallen. Rizzo stood in the foxhole, breathing hard, both hands locked around a 9-foot fishing gaff still slicked to the wire wrapping, and said nothing at all. DeLuca, still half-deaf from the bar fire beside him, stared at Rizzo for a long moment before either man spoke. "What in the hell was that?" he finally said. It wasn't really a question. Rizzo didn't answer it like one. He set the gaff spear back against the foxhole wall, wiped his hands on his trousers, and reloaded his rifle, because the night was not over and a second wave might still come. It did not. By 4:00 a.m., the assault along that stretch of line had collapsed entirely, and word began filtering back that Kawaguchi's attack had failed across the front, not just at Rizzo's position, though nobody at battalion yet understood why the casualties along this particular 100 yards of foxholes looked so different from the rest. At first light, a runner from battalion came down the line collecting casualty reports and stopped cold at Rizzo's position. 7 bodies lay in a rough semicircle in front of the foxhole, each one bearing the same signature wound, a puncture wide enough for a bayonet but torn on one side in a way no bayonet produced, several with the wound running upward through the jaw or throat instead of straight in. Word moved through the company before Rizzo had finished his breakfast ration. Men from 2 platoons overwalked past just to look at the weapon leaning against the foxhole wall. Nobody laughed at it anymore. 2 days earlier, a corporal from another squad had spotted Rizzo cleaning the gaff spear and called it his ancient spear, a joke about a Marine hauling a medieval pike into a modern war. By 8:00 a.m. on October 24th, nobody in the company was joking. Lieutenant Beaumont arrived at 9:30 a.m. and the question he asked was not the one Rizzo expected. "Where did this come from, Rizzo?" "Motor pool scrap, sir. Built it myself." October 17th. "That's an unauthorized modification of government property, and you were away from your post to build it." "Yes, sir." Beaumont looked at the 7 bodies for a long moment before he answered. 7 men in front of 1 foxhole is not something I can pretend I didn't see. Battalion's going to want to talk to you." Word had already outpaced the lieutenant. By mid-morning, men from the mortar section and 2 rifle platoons had walked past the position under one pretext or another, none of them fooling anyone about why they'd actually come. A company clerk logged the casualty count for the sector and flagged it for the battalion surgeon, whose own notes described wound patterns he had not previously documented on Guadalcanal punctures with a torn exit consistent with a barbed rather than a bladed weapon. By noon, a runner arrived with orders for Rizzo to report to the regimental aid station tent, where 2 officers he did not recognize were waiting with the gaff spear already confiscated and laid across a field table between them. The formal inquiry convened on October 27th, 3 days after the assault, in a tent behind the regimental aid station. It was not a full court-martial. The tactical situation on Guadalcanal in late October 1942 left little room for a lengthy proceeding, but a board of 3 officers, chaired by a major from regimental staff, empowered to recommend court-martial, reprimand, or dismissal of charges. Rizzo was questioned for nearly 2 hours. He described the failures he'd watched firsthand: Delaney's broken blade, Esposito's stuck bayonet, Novik's ruined hand, Gallagher's death 11 yards from his own position, and explained in plain mechanical terms why a hooked barb succeeded where a straight blade had not. It did not glance, it did not require withdrawal before a second strike, and a solid hit ended a fight in one motion instead of leaving a wounded man still capable of killing. An ordnance officer summoned from division examined the weapon and confirmed, with some evident surprise, that the barb geometry was not unlike bayonet hook patterns tested and discarded by European armies decades earlier for cost and manufacturing reasons. Reasons that had nothing to do with combat effectiveness and everything to do with standardized production. The debate among the 3 board officers ran long. One favored a formal reprimand and confiscation of the weapon, arguing that unauthorized modifications, however effective, could not be tolerated as a matter of discipline, and that letting the incident pass without consequence would invite every private in the division to start welding whatever he liked in the motor pool. A second pointed to the body count and asked, bluntly, what purpose punishing a man served when the alternative was 7 more graves and a foxhole overrun. Between them sat the uncomfortable fact, raised by the ordnance officer, that the weapon had worked precisely because standard doctrine had failed, and that punishing the failure's correction while leaving the failure itself unaddressed would not read well in any post-war accounting of the campaign. The chairman, the major, ultimately split the difference. Rizzo received no punishment. He also received no medal, no citation, and no formal credit in any divisional report, which instead attributed improved close-quarters casualty rates in the October 23-24 engagement to unspecified adjustments in defensive positioning. The Gaff Spear itself was confiscated, examined by an ordnance liaison, and quietly forwarded up the chain with a recommendation that a hooked bayonet attachment be evaluated for future production. A recommendation that, as far as any surviving record shows, went nowhere before the war ended. Official silence did not stop what had already started. By the evening of October 24th, before the inquiry even convened, 3 other foxholes along the company line had improvised their own hooked spears from tent stakes, motor pool scrap, and in one case, a boat hook liberated from a beached landing craft. By the next morning, a platoon sergeant in a neighboring company had sent a runner asking Rizzo to explain the design. By the end of that week, an unofficial cottage industry had taken hold in the division's rear area motor pools, men bending scrap steel into hooks during off hours, trading finished weapons for cigarettes and canned rations. None of it authorized, all of it tolerated because officers who might otherwise have objected had seen the casualty figures from the Matinicow line. A staff sergeant in the engineer battalion began keeping a rough count of requests for welding time that had nothing to do with vehicle repair, and by November estimated that at least 60 improvised hooked weapons were circulating through frontline units, none of them appearing on any equipment manifest. Officers who did try to intervene found the effort largely pointless. A captain in a neighboring regiment ordered 2 of the weapons confiscated in early November. Within a week, 3 more had appeared in the same company, built by different men who had simply heard the design described secondhand. Nobody was willing to press the issue past a single confiscation when the alternative, on paper, was explaining to a battalion surgeon why a unit had reverted to standard bayonets after adopting something that measurably worked. Divisional medical records for the engagements between October 23rd and November 4th showed a marked shift. Close-quarters fatalities among Marines dropped by an estimated 30% compared to the first 3 weeks of the campaign, even as the intensity of Japanese assaults increased over the same period. Wounded-to-killed ratios in reported bayonet range engagements shifted as well. Surviving medical logs show a higher proportion of enemy casualties recorded as killed outright, rather than wounded and continuing, consistent with a weapon that ended an engagement in a single motion, rather than one that required a follow-up strike. No official report connected the figure to Rizzo's weapon by name. The causal thread survived instead in letters home, in after-action gossip, and in the memories of men who had watched it happen. Japanese accounts of the engagement, gathered after the war from surviving officers of the 2nd Sendai Division, described confusion among assault troops encountering unusual wounds inconsistent with American bayonet doctrine, and at least one post-war interview referenced soldiers warning replacements about a weapon they could not identify, carried by the fishermen. Radio intercepts from early November, translated by division intelligence at the time, noted Japanese commanders advising units to expect irregular American close combat tactics along the Matinico sector specifically, without further elaboration, a detail that meant little to the intelligence officers who logged it and everything to the men who had been in the foxholes 3 weeks earlier. Whether the term spread from a specific incident or became folklore among the survivors is impossible to confirm from surviving records. Angelo Rizzo survived Guadalcanal, survived Cape Gloucester the following year, and was wounded by shrapnel on Peleliu in September 1944, an injury that ended his combat service. He was discharged in early 1945 with the rank of gunnery sergeant and returned to Rocky Neck, where he went back to work on his uncle's swordfish boat within a month of coming home. He married a Gloucester woman, Carla, in 1946. They raised 3 children in a small house 2 streets back from the harbor. He worked the boats for 31 more years, made gaff hook after gaff hook by hand for younger fishermen who wanted one built the old way, and never once mentioned to most of them that the same design had killed 7 men in a foxhole on the other side of the world. Every October 24th, without explaining why to anyone in the house, Rizzo closed the shop early, walked down to the harbor alone, and stood at the end of the breakwater until well after dark. Carla learned, after the first few years, not to ask about it and not to expect him home for dinner on that particular evening. His son later told the historian who eventually pieced the story together that he'd assumed for most of his childhood it was simply a fisherman's superstition, a private ritual tied to some boat or some catch, and had no idea until well into adulthood that it marked anything to do with the war at all. He did not attend division reunions. When his children asked about the war, he described the weather, the food, occasionally a joke about a mess sergeant, and nothing else. His wife later told an interviewer that in 30 years of marriage he had mentioned Guadalcanal by name perhaps a dozen times, and never the events of October 24th. Angelo Rizzo died in 1988 at age 64 of complications from a heart attack in the same house 2 streets from Gloucester Harbor. His obituary in the Gloucester Daily Times ran 4 sentences, noted his Marine Corps service and 2 Purple Hearts, and made no mention of a weapon, a hearing, or 7 bodies in the grass. The hooked field weapon Rizzo, built from scrap steel, and a fisherman's memory never became standard Marine Corps issue. Ordnance boards in 1943 and 1944 examined similar proposals from other units. The design, it turned out, had re-emerged independently at least twice more before the war ended, and each time judged the manufacturing cost and training burden too high to justify replacing the standard bayonet across an entire military. What did change, slowly and without fanfare, was doctrine around close-quarters night defense, emphasis on secondary edged weapons, on barbed or hooked entrenching tool attachments issued informally in Pacific Theater units by 1944, and on training that acknowledged, for the first time in official Marine Corps close combat manuals, that a straight blade was not always the correct answer to a night assault at arm's length. In 2011, a military historian researching Guadalcanal foxhole engagements interviewed Rizzo's surviving daughter and cross-referenced her account against the 1942 inquiry transcript, still held in Marine Corps historical archives, and against DeLuca's own recorded oral history before his death in 2003. The pieces, separately incomplete, matched. DeLuca, in that recorded interview decades earlier, had described the same 11 seconds the same way every time he was asked about it, not as heroism in his telling, but as the only sane response available to a man who had already watched too many friends die from a fight that dragged on a minute too long. A conservative reconstruction of the casualty data suggests the improvised weapon and its rapid unofficial spread through the division may have prevented somewhere between 80 and 120 close-quarters fatalities in the final 2 weeks of the Matanikau campaign alone. A number no official document will ever confirm, because no official document ever fully admitted the weapon existed. The historian's paper, published in a regional military history journal in 2013, remains the only academic account of the incident, and even that account stops short of naming the weapon anything more official than the nickname it had carried since that first joke in the foxhole line, the ancient spear. That is, in the end, how war actually changes, not through a memo from headquarters, not through a board's approval. Through a man in a foxhole who refuses to let the next name on the casualty list be someone he knew, and who is willing to risk a court-martial to make sure of it. The official record moves at the speed of committees. The men doing the dying do not have that luxury, and history, more often than anyone likes to admit, is written first in mud and only much later in ink. Somewhere in a Gloucester attic, according to his daughter, there is still a coil of tempered wire and a length of scrap pipe fitting that Rizzo kept his whole life and never explained. If this story moved you, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more forgotten histories of the men who changed war from the ground up. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Thank you for helping preserve these stories. Rizzo's story is not unique in that respect, only unusually well documented.